the entirety of the Star Wars franchise in itself is like such a notable depiction of world building and immersing yourself in a sort of made up universe, but still managing to maintain a connection to humanity and big questions about life that people can relate to. One of the big themes across, whether or not you're looking at all the movies across the board, I will specifically be highlighting the original franchise of 4, 5, and 6, are sort of ideas of good versus evil, of freedom versus tyranny, with the Rebel Alliance versus the Empire. And the movies sort of frame this idea of good versus evil, and like even the saying of good versus evil seems very like black and white, of this is good, this is bad. But the episodes 4, 5, and 6 do an amazing job of sort of showing that there's a bit of gray area between, why are people good, why are people evil. And this is especially highlighted in the juxtaposition of the protagonist and the antagonist of the series, Luke and Darth Vader. And you kind of see this, especially in their behavior, how they treat others with as individual characters and representations of good versus evil, uh, of Luke's sort of characteristics of being compassionate and kind and brave versus Vader's seeming like lack of compassion and empathy for people, and even with how flippantly he murders people in the series. So they're sort of foils to one another. And when you discover that, spoiler alert, Luke is the son of Darth Vader, you kind of see more how their patterns sort of like mimic each other. So the fact that when they grew up, they both were pilots. They were at one point in their lives powerful Jedis in training. They both lose a limb, their hands, and it's interesting to see like how directly they mimic each other, and that sort of brings up a bigger question about how they got to where they were is a matter of power, of obedience and choice. Like, do they have, if they're destined to sort of be like one another in that idea of like your fate being already laid out, sort of in an Oedipus complex kind of way of psychologically, is that because you are affiliated to that person by blood, is that your fate, is that your destiny, is legacy something that's inevitable because of blood? And this is one of the questions that's sort of brought up a lot in the series with Luke's his destiny to be a hero, to be like his father, to save the universe, to die. And I think the sort of outcomes that the movie proposes with these questions of power, obedience, and control is sort of boils down to two things. Do you choose hope and actively choose to do things in the face of desperation and sort of impossibility, or do you resign to evil? Do you take the easy way out in getting power but not really having the sort of giving up the choice to actively choose to be better? I think that's an interesting thing about good that they bring up, each of the movies brings up, is it's something that you actively work towards. In order to be good, you have to rebel against a bigger power, when ultimately it might be easier to sort of just bend the knee and take the easy way out and not have to suffer. I think one of the interesting things in the film that sort of mimics these questions are the clothing. The films each sort of color code their characters in these ideas of good and evil. So with the rebellion, it's such an array of different people and different life forms, and for the Empire, they sort of have a very strict color scheme going on. They've got the uniformity of wearing red, black, and white. The stormtroopers have masks that are sort of frozen in that sort of like frown. And it sort of stresses that like lack of individuality in the Empire. And I think that's interesting when you look at all the times that we see the rebellion. It's such an array of different people. It's just, you can see how different they are. And this can sort of connect to the ideological level of them just having different concepts of what it means to be good and to recognize the individuality and freedom that people deserve. And I think this is also one of the biggest use of colors in this series, is also in the wardrobe of Luke Skywalker. So when we're first introduced to him, and in 4 and 5, he's sort of wearing white. And I think this connects to these ideas of purity and good intent that sort of conveys in Luke's behavior. It also conveys in what he wears. And so in episode 6, once he's already, it's sort of post-fall, there's sort of a death of innocence with him finding out that he's related to Darth Vader, who's, committed such atrocities to the universe. And Luke, when we first see him, is donned in black. And on top of just wearing like a black outfit that's, sort of connects to this idea of darkness and also is reminiscent of Darth Vader's entire black wardrobe, he's also cloaked in a cloak. And it sort of also mimics his masters of Obi-Wan and Darth Vader and Yoda, and this idea of sort of masking your identity in the same way that Darth Vader's masks his identity. It sort of veils your humanity and for people's ability to see the expression on your face, because emotion can convey a lot on your face. And I think this is one of those things that resonates especially strong in the last film when we see Vader dying, and he asks, even knowing that without his mask it'll kill him, that he wants to actually look at his son with his own two eyes instead of being blocked off by a mask. And you see that under it he's just a human being. So that sort of the idea of empathy and connection is one of the things that is very prevalent in the Star Wars franchise, and one of the very important elements of the universe and sort of the dynamic of Luke and Darth Vader is the Force. It's basically magic in this universe, and sort of the ideas that Fraser puts it in of it, magic being an attempt to alter or control the physical universe, especially the idea of like a natural world. And when you're in space, this sort of expands. The natural world is so different because it's so much beyond human existence and human life. Their planets are natural. They've existed before us. So that idea of magic sort of expanding beyond and encompassing and living within all of these beings is really interesting, especially because humans have to exist in these worlds, but the natural worlds themselves are very deadly. And you sort of see how human evolution has adapted for survival in a way that's very reminiscent to reality, like the harsh landscapes of deserts and tundras that we see throughout the films. You see how humans have sort of crafted technology to be able to do the impossible and to survive with things like being able to fly. It's almost reminiscent of magic's ability to alter and control these things. But ultimately, it's a human creation. And one of the things that is asked a lot in the film is magic more powerful than technology? Could you successfully hurt someone in a battle more easily with a gun than you could, or their blasters, than you could just using the Force or using your bare hands? So I think one of the things that sort of conveys in 4, 5, and 6 is that while technology may be advanced, it is definitely limited compared to something intrinsically innate to human existence, or existence in general for all life forms. That is like the Force. And one of the less prevalent, but still one of the things brought up in the films is this idea of AIs and robot life and whether or not that's being alive. We see C-3PO and R2-D2 in each of the episodes. They're recurring characters. And although they're robots and were technically constructed by humans, you can see that even R2-D2, which we can't even understand what that robot's saying, it still conveys as sort of like a person with empathy and intelligence. And although the robots in the film are shown to have a function and they were created to do things, you kind of see that they're more than just servants or tools, they're characters. So I think that's really interesting. But circling back to the idea of the Force, so the Force is intrinsically linked with myth and ritual. So we've already established that it's part of the natural world, which is sort of a mysticism view of the fact that it permeates sort of everything, and that to control it, which would be an example of a ritual, that active training and the act of actively trying to affect the world. It's something that's rooted in emotion and trust within yourself and of others, we see that sort of process with Luke and his training and how his masters had shaped him. And I think one of the biggest things about the Force, it's that big theme of good versus evil. The idea of dark versus light kind of shows that human nature, or the nature of living things, that they have capacity for both good and evil. So, Luke is established as our hero of the series, but it's shown that Darth Vader sort of wants to convert him to the bad side, that it's possible that he can't just stay perfect and good, that he could be evil if he chose to do so. And that's the Force is established as this thing with power within the film, and it's even referenced in the film as an ancient religion. It's the myth that surrounds the origin of this entire universe, connecting all these different planets and life forms. Whether the characters believe it or not, as sort of an example of this being, I keep thinking the name Harrison Ford. His character's name is Han Solo. We kind of see that he doesn't believe in it in the beginning in the fourth movie, but you kind of see he has to follow along with the heroes and sort of sees how much power the Force has. And one of the sayings that is tossed around a lot in 4, 5, and 6 is that saying, "May the Force be with you." And even if I think the characters believe in this ancient religion, that way of sort of passingly saying, like, I want you to be safe, like, I hope the Force protects you or is with you, is sort of a way of acknowledging how deeply rooted that the Force is in society. It's this myth that sort of dictates human behavior to a degree. And so again, like, the idea of being able to control it, to magically control the Force, is a ritual, and the training that goes within this process is a ritual. And the masters of our main characters, Luke, with Obi-Wan and Yoda, and then Darth Vader with the Emperor Palpatine, you kind of see that both of them know that the Force is powerful. And while on the other hand, Obi-Wan and Yoda, they sort of understand the gravity of this power. And Yoda even makes it a point to say that the Force is to be used for knowledge and defense, not to attack people, in opposition to the Emperor being like, let's murder people and take over the universe. And there's this idea of nobility, even with being called a Jedi Knight, sort of the connotation of that title is something of, there's respect for this. You have to understand the gravity of your position and your responsibility to protect people. I think that's really interesting. And, sort of wrapping up this discussion, something that is central to each of these movies is the use of the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell's idea of this narrative pattern that you can use for storytelling. And I think this narrative pattern actually works for each of the episodes individually, and then also works as a collective narrative, because you can kind of see the films as one whole story just chopped into 3 bits. So this idea that this pattern has stages that the characters, especially the hero, moves through. They sort of repeat themselves within each of the films. Off the top of my head, some of the first ones that sort of stick out are Denial of the Quest. There's a lot of near-death trials of seemingly like impossible saves from impossible situations. There's literally venturing into the belly of the beast, sort of being stuck at a very low point, and literally they've been in planets that seem like, I remember that one place that seemed like a planet, and then they realized they were inside a creature. And that's always a threat, like you'll be dropped into something that'll eat you. So that's sometimes like a literal interpretation in the films. But one of the biggest sort of narrative steps in Campbell's pattern is the resurrection. Each of these films, they sort of cycle around this dynamic between Luke and Vader as the representations of good and evil. And at the end of each film, there's some form of like a big battle between the two, and in a style very reminiscent to Francis Ferguson's Rhythm of Action. So the idea of this hero's progression being broken up into purpose, passion, and perception, especially in one particular battle. I think this kind of shows in Luke's repeated death of ignorance and innocence in each of the films. Like, you kind of see at the end of episode 4, he just lived his regular life with parents that his uncle and aunt, and he didn't really question much, but he yearned for adventure. And, by the end of episode 4, you kind of see him understanding the gravity of the situation, and that the Empire and the rebellion are not something far away from his life. They directly hurt the people that he cared about. So you kind of see at the end of this film, he initially confronts Vader, but they're not actually physically fighting. They're piloting their own respective ships, but you kind of see Vader and Luke recognizing each other directly as foes. Like, this is someone I'm going to fight. And in episode 5, you kind of see, with their big physical battle, Vader being able to undermine Luke's beliefs by saying, like, I'm your father, and then Luke questions, you can kind of see the gears turning in his head, like, well, if he's my father, then what does that say about me? Like, I wanted to become a Jedi to be like my father, but if my father became evil, then who am I? It's so really interesting questions that are sort of explored in that narrative, and also in the sixth film. But by the end of the sixth film, you kind of see his resolution, what he's going to do. He wants to save Vader because he can still see good in him. And I think that was a very beautiful thing to sort of see him recognize him not as just Vader, but actually calling him my father, Anakin. And then you see Vader also calling him my son, these acknowledging the familial ties that kind of bind them. It's in a very, and then ultimately, Luke understands that he has the pressure to save the universe, but he also won't set aside that he wants to save his father. So it's this idea, the resurrection of this big battle that sort of changes everything. And episode 6, it's the culmination of this entire journey of two movies preceding it, sort of laying out this narrative. So Star Wars and its emphasis on the Force especially, is intrinsically linked with myth and ritual. Like, Star Wars would not be the same without the Force or without pulling from myth and ritual.